Hello, and welcome to the Bitcoin Butlers podcast. I am Mike Watkins, and with me, as always, is my good friend and business partner, Matt Burke.
Hello.
And each week, we try and bring you an intellectually honest discussion about news and events affecting Bitcoin. If you like our content, please like, subscribe, and share. So, this week marked the 1 year anniversary of El Salvador adopting Bitcoin. And I think it's a great time to look back and see what effect the adoption has had on the country. We spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to predict where things will be in the future. But here we have an opportunity to look back on one of the most significant events in Bitcoin history. But first, there's some really big news coming out of the US. And Matt, if you don't mind, tell us about that, please.
Yeah, so we heard today that Fidelity, Citadel, and Charles Schwab are going to be launching a Bitcoin and crypto exchange. And this is big news in the sense that you've got these three huge legacy financial institutions that have decided they want to have a separate exchange where their customers can buy Bitcoin and other crypto assets. So, clearly this is an attempt for them to get market share from folks like Coinbase and Binance and Kraken and FTX and Gemini. Um, and it's really significant because you've got these, you know, what I'll call old school, longtime legacy institutions that are now saying we want to get into this game. We see the opportunity there. We see that the asset class is big enough to make it worth our while to uh, be a broker in there, and so they're going to jump in.
hmm What I thought was interesting about this is that it wasn't Schwab saying, "Hey, just like you can buy stocks on our platform." And Schwab, by the way, is TD Ameritrade. Also, now they merged. I think they
Hmm.
may just be called Charles Schwab, but it's Schwab and what was TD Ameritrade. So it's bigger than just Charles Schwab. It's this new, larger company. And so instead of just Charles Schwab, who's financial titan, announcing that they're going to do it, they teamed up with Citadel and Fidelity and a few other players. I think is Sequoia Capital part of this? I think Sequoia Capital is
Sequoia
part of it.
is there are a lot of investors kind of behind the scenes in this
Hmm
deal, it seems like. But yeah, there were several other large ones that were mentioned: Sequoia, Paradigm, Virtue Financial, all involved.
So what you kind of had here on some levels are competitors. I'm sure they compete. I'm sure all these companies compete with each other in a number of areas. But you had all of these giants come together and sort of mount an attack against the three biggest established players, which you mentioned before. Now,
Right.
you don't see that often. And we didn't see that in the smartphone area. Like you didn't see Samsung and Sony and Panasonic all getting together to make a phone to compete with iPhone. Samsung had their phone. Um, all the different suppliers had their own device. Sony had their own phone, etc. So I think it's really interesting that they joined together, joined forces, so to speak, to launch this new service.
Well, I would also imagine that there's some element of that that has to do with regulation, meaning that if if they team up together, it's a much bigger monster to fight.
hmm hmm And one of the other things I thought was really interesting about this is that they're saying that the transactions will be settled on the blockchain. So it's not just that they're going to be offering Bitcoin and other crypto trading services, but they're going to be using the blockchain to settle these, right? So they're using a new technology rather than just trading these new, we'll call it these new digital assets, but using old technology to settle the transactions. They
Hmm.
actually are talking about settling it on the blockchain and using some of the efficiencies of the blockchain to keep a better ledger between all these different firms.
Yeah, which is really smart because that's actually one of the biggest benefits of having a blockchain, is that it's self audited and transparent and verifiable. So if you're buying Bitcoin, for example, on this exchange and it settles on chain, you can check that transaction independently, make sure that everything went through, and you're not relying on IOUs to the same extent that you are in a lot of these other situations.
Mm-hmm. There are also a couple of quotes I'd like to read from this article here.
Yeah.
It says crypto is a $1 trillion global asset class with over 300 billion participants and pent up demand from millions more, said EDXM's board of directors.
Yeah. And I don't
So,
think we mentioned that EDXM is the name of the exchange that they're going to launch.
correct, correct. Although, is that really what they're going to call it? EDXM? Like that's the name they're going to give it? We
Yeah. EDX markets is what
EDX
they're.
markets. Okay. And I guess people call it EDXM. So I think it's worth kind of reiterating that this is according to them, crypto is a $1 trillion global asset class with over 300 million participants. And this is the part I thought was interesting,
Mm-hmm.
and pent up demand from millions more.
Right. That's implying that there are millions of people who want to buy these assets that can't. They
Mm-hmm.
can't currently, and so now they'll
Mm-hmm.
be able to. So, you know, that's a very bullish position to take. That you're launching this thing under the assumption that all of these people who couldn't previously get to these assets will now be buying it. That can only help.
Right. I mean, they're putting this in their press release, this pent up demand from millions more people. And then it goes on. It says unlocking this demand requires a platform that can meet the needs of both retail traders and institutional investors with high compliance and security standards.
Yeah, it's a serious announcement. This is I think it'll be interesting to see where this EDX market lands, but I could see it being very big, very fast.
Mm-hmm. Part of me thinks that we're so jaded by all the things that we're seeing, because news like this, and I know Bitcoin was down a bit today because of the inflation report,
Right.
but news like absent that, news like this hitting the Bitcoin market should move Bitcoin up like minimum of 10%, in my opinion. If you're talking about the price really reflecting what's going on with the asset class, but because we're seeing these really, really huge stories. And what is this story sort of at 30,000 feet? This story at 30,000 feet is some of the largest financial institutions in the United States and the world, for that
The
matter,
world. Yeah.
are joining together to create a new exchange for Bitcoin and other digital assets. And they're talking about having demand, pent up demand from millions of people. And I don't doubt it. I'm willing to bet that there are a lot of people who are not comfortable with using Coinbase. And there are even more people who are not comfortable using Binance.
Absolutely.
And FTX, I don't have a comment on, but I can guarantee you there are people that are not comfortable using FTX. I've never heard of it. I don't know what it is. I don't know if I can trust it.
Mm-hmm.
Just a trust factor is huge. And so to have Fidelity and Schwab and also these other, I don't know what the right term is for them, these other big financial titans. That's really what they are.
Mm-hmm.
These are like just some of the biggest names in finance. They may not have, some of them may not have a lot of consumer facing things, but Sequoia Capital is a monster.
Huge.
So this news is really, we've said before on the show, the world's adopted Bitcoin. They just don't realize it yet.
Right.
I think this fits into that category.
Yeah, and
And
I think you made the point earlier that the price of Bitcoin went down um, today because of the inflation news, and that's just another. It just shows the general lack of understanding of what it is. If people truly understood what it was, then you would see the price going up when there were unfavorable inflation announcements. But because right now it's tied to the stock market as more of a risk on asset, um, this is what happens. And so I think, in order to bring the knowledge of what it is to a massive amount of people, it's going to take these types of respected institutions to get behind it.
I think that they know that their customer. I got two things on this. One, I think they know their customer base is probably going to put, and I'm speculating here, 1 to 2% of their assets in this on a global scale, right? Some people obviously put 70% of their assets in it. Some people put 0%. I don't know. I just feel that um, that statement of pent up demand coming from these kind of conservative institutions, I understand a bit of it can be, kind of a sales pitch. We get it. It's a press release. It's not being graded by anybody. It's not being peer reviewed or anything. And you want to promote what you're doing. But still, I think that is really significant. And we know the demand is out there. We're seeing this on a worldwide scale. We
Yeah.
have other stories tonight from other countries that all have the exact same position.
But to your point, I was Googling while you were talking that, Citadel and Schwab and Fidelity, roughly, just with quick Google searches, have, around $13 trillion of assets under management. So, if you're talking about, even if you're only talking about 1%, you're talking about a really significant number.
It's huge. And there's something else that I'd like to mention here, which is the efficient market hypothesis. So I was actually having this discussion with someone at lunch today, just talking about how irrational the markets are.
Mhm.
And for people that do not know, the markets are irrational. There'll probably be people that argue with me. That's fine. But I've been watching the markets for 2+ decades, and they're always irrational. There are obviously rational times, and they tend to kind of get things right long term, but on a day-to-day thing, they're pretty irrational. And so there's this theory called the efficient market hypothesis, which states that all known information is reflected in real time in every stock price, meaning everyone knows everything about Apple that there is to
Right.
know. And all of that information is put into sort of a very large pool, and the market gets a price right at any given moment. And that's actually someone's hypothesis. I don't know whose it is. It's a terrible hypothesis because it's not accurate.
Well,
The
it's not.
reality,
Yeah, it's proven to be wrong. And if you take that hypothesis and you extrapolate it to Bitcoin, you can see that it completely fails when you understand just even the basic capabilities of Bitcoin as a payment rail. That's not reflected in the price. So yes, I agree with you that the efficient market theory is not really well proven in my opinion, and I think there are elements of it that are true. I think sometimes you can point to certain amounts of information having been taken into account in a given market, but to be able to say that all known information is baked in is just it's just not true.
it's not true. And I agree. We're definitely not seeing it with Bitcoin because one of the problems with Bitcoin is you need to understand Bitcoin, and so few understand it. And anytime, just a proof of that, anytime that you get this bad inflation number, Bitcoin should go up because it doesn't inflate. That's kind of the point, or it's one of the points, is that it doesn't inflate. So the other the other money that you're using to exchange for Bitcoin is essentially becoming worth less.
Right. And the one counter to that I'll make is that when you talk about CPI type of inflation, which is what came out today, that's less of what Bitcoin is designed to be a hedge against.
Mm.
Bitcoin is designed to be more of a hedge against money printing type of inflation, the expansion of the money supply. So I guess we can give it that. If it was but at the same time, we didn't see the price of Bitcoin go up significantly when there was recently announced that there was going to be a $300 to $500 billion student loan forgiveness program. That type of news in a knowledgeable market would have made the price go up.
Well, that's the thing. It's just simply not a knowledgeable market. I don't know what the market will be like, let's say in like 10 years. Will it still be behind? Will it still not know much? We don't know. I don't know how much the average person will really understand Bitcoin in 10 years. Bitcoin can be kind of tough to get your head around.
Well, it's more about adoption and it being used for actual um, I don't want to say day-to-day functions because doesn't have to be used like that, but it needs to be more incorporated into people's daily lives in the same way that other assets are before. You know, you don't have to fully understand it to use it. Just like
Mhm.
you don't necessarily know how your iPhone works, but you can use it pretty well. Uh,
You also don't need to understand gold to know that gold has value because it's scarce.
sure.
And Bitcoin is about to be twice as scarce as Bitcoin. I'm sorry, Bitcoin is about to be twice as scarce as gold in 2024.
Mhm. All right. Well, that's big news in the U.S. markets. You want to jump to the next story?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, this was an opinion piece in Bitcoin Magazine. It was interesting by Jaime Garcia about 1 year later, the success of making Bitcoin legal tender in El Salvador. And this article was really kind of focusing on what's happened in El Salvador since they made the announcement last year that they were adopting Bitcoin as legal tender. And I think was it September 7th last year that the law went into effect?
I believe so.
7th or
Yes,
8th, somewhere around there.
somewhere there.
I know I bought a little bit of Bitcoin that day symbolically.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on this one?
Well, I think that if we're going to be intellectually honest, we have to point out that this did not go as expected.
100%.
So I would say that the overall adoption, the wallet rollout went poorly, but to me, that actually went as expected because you're never going to roll out a piece of software like that and have it work. So I know some people got upset that the wallet rollout didn't work well, but that's new software, and that's kind of par for the course.
Sure.
But with that, you could say, okay, well, the rollout was bad. How's the overall adoption? And I don't think there's really great adoption numbers that we can rely on. But I would say that we can all agree that it has not hit the targets that we would have hoped for a year ago.
Sure.
Also, they were supposed to have this big bond offering, and Nayib Bukele was supposed to come to the Bitcoin conference. He was one of the featured speakers. And then at the conference, they announced he's not going to show up. And they were also going to have these bonds, and it was going to be a thing where if you bought enough in their bonds, you would have I don't know if it was a passport or like a residency or some
Mm-hmm.
type of citizenship for El Salvador. And we were told, well, the bonds are just going to be delayed until this month. And then it was that month. And now it is middle of September, and we still have no news on the bonds. And let's be serious, they're probably not going to come out this year. We don't know what those issues are.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say that El Salvador has taken a lot of heat for what's happened, particularly what's happened with the Bitcoin price. Like, oh, you invested this money, you bought,
Mm-hmm.
your country spent this money buying Bitcoin, and now that Bitcoin is worth, I think they started buying was like 30, so they've lost like a third on it or
At least.
so.
Yep. Yep.
And so there are certainly arguments to be made here of why this didn't go well. And I think those are reasonable, but we haven't talked about what did happen to El Salvador a year later. What were some of the positives? And I'd like to know what you thought one or first or second biggest positives that came out of this.
Well, I think the obvious one is the tourism increase. There's been a 30% increase in tourism there. GDP increase up 10.3% in the past year. I believe it was the first time in El Salvador's history where they had double-digit GDP growth year over year.
Mhm.
Um, but what I found probably the most interesting was that one of the things that they touted about this Bitcoin law was that it was going to really make remittances cheaper and more efficient for people who are working outside of El Salvador and sending money back to their families there. And that number was only up about 3.3% over the last year. What I think was really drastically different, though, was that they're up almost double, like 70.2% year over year in remittances coming into the country for investment purposes. So for people who aren't El Salvadorans, that aren't remitting their own wages back to their families, these are people that are third parties putting money into the El Salvador economy voluntarily. So I think that to me was very significant, because what it tells you is that there's more infrastructure being built.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and I agree with all that. I think that we've seen a number of interesting things come out of El Salvador, but I think that, to me, one of the biggest things that came out of it was it put El Salvador on the world stage. El Salvador is a country that I don't think most people knew much about. I don't think most people know much about it now, but El Salvador was never in the news. Maybe there was like a gang killing or some kind of weird
Right.
thing going on
If you
there.
asked me 2 years ago, 3 years ago, what do you know about El Salvador? And I would say not much, but I think it's pretty dangerous there.
Same. And so what they've done now is that El Salvador is being discussed. It's being discussed on the world stage. Part of the discussion is, what's it like for a country to have adopted Bitcoin? Because whatever you want to say about El Salvador, at this point, we can say they were the first country in the world to adopt Bitcoin. How that plays out 20 years from now, we don't know. But they were the first country in the world to adopt Bitcoin. And they did not have a financial apocalypse. Things worked out fine. Actually, they didn't work out fine. They worked out great.
I think
What
so.
happened?
And there was a quote, and I think it was in the article, or maybe I saw it on Twitter, but it was something along the lines of, it's very easy to overestimate what you're going to accomplish in 1 year, and really easy to underestimate what you're going to accomplish in 10 years. So I think that's a really salient point to make here, which is that when you announce it, you've got all this enthusiasm around the idea. It's the first legal tender country. They're going to build a Bitcoin economy. And, within the first year, people are already saying it failed. And while it didn't go perfectly, and there are things that maybe, aren't as good as they were a year ago, there are a lot of things that are better. And the point is that let's wait and see what happens 10 years from now. If you continue to see this kind of economic growth, just in terms of their GDP, if you see more people going there on vacation as a destination, if they continue to raise investment dollars that's going to push it further into the modern world, those are all things that would never be realized within a year. We're talking multiple years, probably a decade, before you can really look back and say, did this, succeed or fail?
Well, I would kind of argue with that. I think this has been a huge success. I think it's very, very difficult to look at this and not say it was a huge success. Just a couple of metrics you mentioned. Their GDP is up 10%. Okay, well, it's up 10%. I guess that was 2021.
Yep.
Okay. How did their GDP growth compare to the rest of the world? Do you know?
I don't know, but I can probably find out.
I think it's right up there with some of the best growth that we've seen from any country. And then let's talk about tourism. Tourism up 30%. That's like iPhone kind of growth in early iPhone stages, where they were 30% more buy each year. I mean, keep in mind that 3 years in a row of 30% growth is massive. Even 2 years in a row of 30% growth is really massive. So 30% increase in tourism means that a lot of outside money is coming in and being spent there.
Right.
Well,
And by the way, I did look this up, and it's not apples to apples totally, but when you look at the countries in the world that, have high rates of GDP growth, say, above 10%, and, or the top 10, these are all countries that, it's probably a lot easier for them to get double digit growth because they're not that big to begin with. We're talking about, Honduras, Peru, Bahamas, Panama, Libya. So, we're talking about much smaller economies. And so I think to put El Salvador's GDP growth in the context of those same countries is I would say that's a big upgrade for El Salvador.
that's the thing, is that what it's regardless of the Bitcoin part, regardless of how the whole Bitcoin experiment plays out, and I think we can see it's playing out great, but regardless of what ends up happening with it, this has been a net benefit, a significant net benefit to El Salvador. I think it's difficult to argue against that. You can say that things didn't go right because things didn't go right, but you have to add up all the positives and all the
Mhm.
negatives together and say, is this a net benefit or is this a net loss? And I think if you say that this is a net loss, I think if you argue this is a net loss for El Salvador, then you're either not intellectually honest, um, or you're not putting all of the facts together. You're not adding up all the pluses and minuses correctly.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really overall, it's incredibly impressive what's happened there in the past year.
Hmm. And I could argue once again, I'm going to go back to something I said before, which on the Fidelity Schwab and the Schwab news, is that when you have this Fidelity Schwab news, and then you see what's happened to this country that was like a lost country, a forgotten country almost. No offense to El Salvador, but you see what's happened to them after 1 year in this grand experiment. And the things that you're pointing to are very minor compared to the gains the country had. One of the I know one of the things they talk about is the country lost money. People love to say the country bought this Bitcoin, they lost money. And I don't know what the country lost, maybe 100 million.
Well,
I'm not sure well, first they lost nothing because they haven't sold anything.
but again, those are the same people that are basing their opinion of Bitcoin on the price of Bitcoin.
There are also people that get paid to say things that
To
certain
be
people want
naysayers,
them to say,
right?
right?
Yeah,
I mean, there are people that get paid to, to be naysayers or to be cheerleaders. I mean, there are people in the press that are paid to have a position, and that's been around since the beginning of time. It's never going
sure.
to change. So you just need to be careful when you're reading an article. Is this person really thoughtful and intellectually honest, or are they maybe a bit ignorant and or being paid to come up with a position that is somewhat ridiculous?
Mhm. All right. Well, anything else on El Salvador? Should we move on?
I don't have anything else. I think it's amazing. I think that's going to take time to digest just the significance of it. And I think we're going to continue to see it evolve. And I'm really curious what year two brings for El Salvador. Do they continue the momentum?
Yeah,
You know, what kind of roadblocks are there? Now the kind of the rubber hits the road and they have to start implementing some things like their volcano mining. How does that
sure.
go? Are they actually going to be able to use free energy or stranded energy to mine Bitcoin? Can they prove this concept? And I think that would be significant. And also, are they going to build a bunch of like, you know, tourist uh, villas and, tourist
More
houses,
Bitcoin beaches.
condos, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
Bitcoin beaches. Is that going to continue? Are people going to really invest in the tourism there?
Well,
And
yeah,
they're on the beach,
sure. Well,
so it's good real estate.
yeah, and maybe one last thing I'll mention is that the other thing that is more of an intangible, although you could probably research it and verify it, but how many other jurisdictions decided that they were going to do something with Bitcoin, whether that's setting up other economic zones, whether it's the Central African Republic, whoever it is, how many of those ventures would have been taken on if El Salvador didn't do this a year ago? And I think that that part of it is that it's a catalyst for other places to do similar things. And the more of those things that happen, the more adoption we see.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I didn't really think of that. That it's definitely affected other countries in the world, and I I think we see that sort of all over, not just with what El Salvador is doing.
Yeah. But,
But but
again,
I
there,
but I think that this has really, well, I shouldn't say that we see that all over. There's a couple of stories tonight which I think were somewhat influenced by El Salvador and what people saw happening there,
well,
particularly, uh, I don't know where we have a story on Bahrain, and I feel like they were influenced when I
yeah,
read what was going on there by El Salvador.
I think that's the next one. But yeah, and the point was that I'm sure you could talk to people in these places and ask them if El Salvador impacted their decision to do this, and I think you would find a lot of them would say absolutely yes. So, um, let's go on. So here, yeah, the Central Bank of Bahrain, um, in conjunction with OpenNode, is going to be testing Bitcoin payments through their central bank. So I thought this was pretty interesting. By the way, another article from Sean Amick over at Bitcoin Magazine. We tend to talk about a lot of his articles.
Hmm. Yeah. So what I thought was interesting about this was, this is the article that I thought was, uh, sort of influenced by El Salvador, or this
Mhm.
move was influenced by El Salvador. And I guess Bahrain has a central bank. I don't think El Salvador has a central bank,
Correct.
right?
Mhm.
And so this is the first time that I can remember hearing about a central bank and the adoption of Bitcoin.
Yeah, what I think was interesting about this is that, and it is a lightning
Mhm.
story, meaning that they're not saying that they're making Bitcoin legal tender. They're saying that we've got a payment network, I guess, and I don't know anything about Bahrain Central Bank, but if it works like other central banks, what they're talking about is something maybe like the equivalent of the ACH network in the U.S. or some sort of electronic payment that's some decades old type of transmittal service for payments, payment rails, if you will, and that they're going to now test using the Lightning Network as those rails for the payments going through their bank. And
Mhm.
that's what I thought was significant about this is that, first of all, we don't, like you said, we don't hear a whole lot about central banks doing anything with Bitcoin. So I thought that that was significant. And then the fact that that they're going to be setting up this testing ground means that they're they want to innovate. They want to come up with novel ways to make payments through their banking system that don't exist today. So I think that both of those are really positive.
Mhm. And I wanna read a couple quotes from this article, um, that kinda relate back to the El Salvador thing. So, it says, "OpenNode intends to showcase Bitcoin's ability to strengthen the Bahrain economy and show why Bitcoin is synonymous with good business." So, the key point there was to show how it can strengthen Bahrain's economy, much the same way that, Bitcoin strengthened El Salvador's economy. And again, later in the same article, it says OpenNode intends to show the central bank that Bitcoin has the capacity to expand the Bahrain economy by strengthening businesses in the region.
Mhm.
So I don't know if maybe Bahrain is looking to, where El Salvador is sort of the kind of a bit of a Bitcoin hub for Central America, where, if Bahrain is looking to do this in the Middle East, that they want to take more of a leadership role. And obviously, here it looks like providing some kind of payment rails. We don't know
Mhm.
exactly what the objective is, but it looks like maybe a bit of an attempt for Bahrain, which is like a kind of a small island out that
Yeah,
area.
it's an island, but I think it's a fairly wealthy
Yeah.
country, and their GDP is um, it's somewhere in the it's $38 billion, something like that GDP.
Hmm.
Where El Salvador I think is just under 25, 24 billion, something like that. So
Hmm.
it's significantly bigger than El Salvador in terms of the size of their economy.
Hmm.
And I think that there's probably, just given the fact that it is a Middle Eastern country, I believe there is, significant oil money there. Um, that there's also maybe um, not as much of you've got higher GDP per capita, I guess is the way to put it.
Certainly.
Um,
So once I think that in one way, this article is just about Bahrain, Middle East. Middle East is getting involved in the game, and they are. This is a payment story and a lightning story. This is not setting up an exchange story, right? Just to show the contrast. So I think this one's really interesting. We're going to see what kind of role they take with this and how this one plays out.
well, yeah, and I just Googled this because it was intriguing me. And the GDP per capita of Bahrain is about 8 times that of El Salvador.
Can I guess on the GDP per capita? I'm gonna say 55,000 per
N-
person.
Now you're about double. It's,
Oh, it's 27,000.
23,000 and
Okay.
change for Bahrain, and 3,800 roughly for El Salvador.
Wow. Wow.
Big difference there.
Hmm.
So, um, what else? Anything else about Bahrain? I think again, it's we haven't seen a ton coming out of the Middle East in this sense. I mean, we hear stories about Iran from time to time. There's been, I think we had a Saudi Arabia story, but there's not a whole lot of significant news. I think we hear more coming out of uh, Africa and Latin America and parts of Europe, much more than the Middle East. So I think
Mm.
this is another new country to add to
Hmm.
our list of countries that have done something along the lines of Bitcoin.
Right. And if we just step back and say, like, these countries are just adding up, I know we've got a couple more countries tonight. You just see that there's this worldwide adoption going on, even though most people do not know it. It's certainly
Yep,
not reflected in the day-to-day news. You hear more about, Bitcoin crashing or the Ethereum merge or whatever, but all these things going on. They're just getting overlooked because I don't think they generate that many clicks.
sure. All right, well, let's go to the next country on that note. Singapore. Singapore's largest bank is going to expand their Bitcoin and other crypto services.
Hmm. And this is only so. Before we get into this one,
Mhm.
what we have in the same week is in the U.S. all of these financial titans getting together and creating this um, giant, we'll call it crypto exchange.
Mhm.
And then you have this other country, Singapore, and it's their largest bank, not a bank in Singapore, but their largest bank to get into Bitcoin and crypto services. But this is only for their richest customers. But
Right.
still, what we're seeing is the biggest players in each country. We've seen kind of a trend on this, and we've seen it in some other countries. The biggest players in each country are getting involved.
Yeah, and they're not an insignificant player. I mean, we're talking they're not clearly not as big as the largest U.S. or European banks, but you're talking about roughly $500 billion in total assets. They have like 488 billion in
Mhm.
assets, which that would put them in the same category as like Bank of New York Mellon or Capital One Bank. That TD Bank I think is about the same size. So these are not insignificant institutions when you think about them in terms of asset size, but it's again the biggest in the country, so it's the equivalent of the biggest bank here declaring that they're going to get into this space.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Just amazing.
I thought another interesting thing about this, if you look at if you're watching and you see the headline, a mid bear market, they're going to expand
Mm-hmm.
Bitcoin services a mid bear market. And I thought that was an interesting point to their announcement of it, was that we're really excited about doing this, but we're also a little worried. It was an interesting kind of dynamic in the way that I interpreted that, just that it seems like they recognize the opportunity, but they also recognize that, not everybody is going to think that this is a great thing, and that, there's going to be naysayers, and they want to try to, I guess, spin their way out of that politically.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things they said in this article was that this is the CEO of the bank. He said that the market downtrend influenced the bank's decision to expand its infrastructure due to a need for consumer protections. And that's, I think, what we're going to see from a lot of these banks, which is like, okay, you can't trust Coinbase, you can't trust FTX. You need us to look after you in the same way we've looked after you in the past, because the banks, we're here to protect you. It's all consumer protections. We're barely making a nickel off of all of our kindness to you and all of our care and making sure that you're protected.
Right.
So they always talk about that, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, I think it sells, and I think people need to feel very comfortable doing some of these things. I think while we advocate for Bitcoin self-custody, and if you understand Bitcoin, you should self-custody, and there are a number of service providers that can provide easy self-custody. But for a lot of people, that's such a big change for the way that they would do anything. It's such a big change from the way they've thought of things in the past. And so I just think that they're comfortable. If their bank, they just trust their bank. There are some people that, if we're going to be honest, there's some people don't really trust the banks that much or are not a big fan of the bank. But people generally trust the banks. The banks in most countries have well, if you don't trust the bank falls. The bank
Right.
collapses. If there's a bank that people didn't trust, the bank is done. People will withdraw their money and there's no more banks. So I think these things are really neat. And I think that Singapore jumping into the game with their largest bank, and I love the way they're always introducing it to their richest customers only,
Right.
right? Only the rich are allowed to get richer. But welcome to the party, Singapore.
Yeah. All right. And the last one here is Dubai. Luxury resort Palazzo Versace Dubai now accepts Bitcoin. So this is another one of these high ticket item luxury brands announcing that they're going to accept Bitcoin. This is going to be in a partnership with Binance, which I thought that was interesting. I don't know that we've talked about a Binance supported Bitcoin acceptance. I think we've talked about Binance doing other things that were more generic crypto or BNB token focused, but that they are that they're going to be working with this resort to allow them to accept Bitcoin.
Yeah, this article to me is a little different than some of the other resorts that accept Bitcoin, because you can pay for things on the property with Bitcoin through the Binance app. So I tried to book a room with this today, and
Yeah.
you can't book a room with Bitcoin. But and they even said that they plan to launch the online payment integration later, but I always like to check and see if it's there. But you can pay for things on site. So if we want to think about it, so sort of like a smaller microcosm of like the El Salvador economy, you can go into this resort and you can use your Binance app and pay for massages and meals, I guess, and whatever else they have on that property. using your Bitcoin.
Mhm.
And we haven't seen that where someone using this Binance app to do that.
Yeah, we've actually seen the opposite in a sense where, we have a lot of articles about sports arenas accepting payments for tickets in crypto, but
Mm,
they're not selling hot dogs and beers using the Binance app, or paying with Lightning Network. So this is kind of the inverse of that, where they're rolling out the on-premise, uh, the concessions, if you will, before they're
right.
rolling out the tickets.
Right. So the other ones, most of these places were just using BitPay. Even some of the luxury brands, the
Mhm.
luxury watches, all they did was add BitPay payment rails to their checkout. There's nothing wrong with that. This, they didn't add the BitPay payment rails. However, they're using this Binance app.
Mhm.
So that's new.
Yeah, interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Well, the a couple other things I was going to mention. There were a couple of things we didn't talk about today. The first one was there was a White House report that came out last week about cryptocurrency and energy, and basically a response to the executive order that came out earlier this year. And I think we're going to do a separate discussion on that. We both want to take the opportunity to really digest it and be able to analyze it and give our feedback on it. But we know that was news this week, and we weren't ready to talk about it yet. So that'll come.
Mm. It's going to take a lot of effort to go through there and kind of pick apart what they got right and what they got wrong. And we know it's a bit of both.
Yep. And actually, if there's anything just initially that I thought was positive about it, was that it wasn't all negative.
Yeah. I don't know how that plays out. I don't have a lot of experience in this area to understand what what these reports have looked like in the past. This would be the first one I've ever read. And um the government usually gets things wrong, more or less. So uh I think we're going to go in there and really in depth and pick apart uh, the important pieces of that and do that in a later show, if not the
Yeah,
next show.
I would like to do that. So, all right, what else?
I think it was a big week. I think it was a really interesting week. I know when I saw the Fidelity news, I sent it to you as soon as I saw it, and you'd seen it like an hour or two before
Right.
me, and we both knew that was kind of came out of nowhere. Um, we certainly didn't see that on the horizon, which just shows you just how little you know about what's really going on. That these things, we talked about in the past when these big financial institutions and big companies get involved in anything, it takes them months and months and months of meetings and hand wringing and planning and you know,
Absolutely.
there's so many roadblocks and hurdles to get through. And yet people think they know what's really happening and what's going on in the community, and all of a sudden you get this announcement that I'd never
Right.
heard any rumblings about it. I didn't know anything, and I didn't see any people on online today sort of spiking the ball and saying, "I told you this was coming."
Sure.
It was sort of just a wow from everybody. And so that also means that there are other things like this going on that we don't know about. Now, one of the one of the things I think we try and do with these shows is to try to get a real sense of where is Bitcoin? What's really going on with Bitcoin and Bitcoin adoption? And that's, we said before, just both a positive front and a negative front. Um, Certainly, I would say in a lot of ways you could argue on the negative front would be the Bitcoin price right now. I think a lot of people are feeling that. I think there's some number of metrics you can use, what percent of people are underwater, et cetera, et
Hmm.
cetera. I think that it's clearly been sort of universally accepted that we're in a bear market or a crypto winter, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
But so the price would be a bad thing. And if you want to focus on that, then I don't know what kind of good that does for you. The reality is that the macroeconomic outlook and the infrastructure and the adoption is not slowing down. It's changing very rapidly.
Oh yeah,
So
the amount of money being poured into the space is just astonishing. There's tons of investments being made um, in all kinds of companies, not just mining and exchanges and wallet companies or whatever. There's all kinds of things happening behind the scenes that some, if you get really into it, you can learn about it. Some of it we won't know about it until it happens.
no, but it almost seems to me that the big institutions are recognizing that this is not a fad, right?
Yeah, I think that's
This isn't a goof. This is a serious thing, and they've all ignored it. Let's be serious. If you're an institution, if you're Fidelity or Schwab, you're getting into this digital asset and this exchange now. You're getting into it. You haven't even launched yet, and it's September 2022.
mhm,
And you can't tell me that if they had a time machine and could go backwards, that they wouldn't have started up the exchange in 2016. Schwab was just done on their own.
sure.
Schwab would have tried to push out Coinbase or whatever. They would have been a more reputable institution. Who knows what they would have done? But they would have loved to have had that market share all this time.
Absolutely.
So what it tells you is that they've been on the sidelines. They've been waiting and waiting. And even that article from Schwab, we talked about how they had this pent up demand, which I thought was really an unusual thing to see in a press release
Mhm.
from a financial institution. Kind of more of a legacy financial institution adopting digital assets. It's a weird thing, for them to admit that our customers really want in.
Yeah. And they're not just saying that. They wouldn't just come out and say, "Oh, our customers really want it." I mean, their customers really want it.
Right. I mean, we don't know the numbers. They know their metrics. We don't know those, but we're seeing all these things happen. And then I think, and maybe this is just my optimistic outlook, that in like 2024, and even maybe sometime before that, we're going to see like I'm going to call it the great realization. Maybe that's the wrong term for it. I just made that up right now, which is that people are going to realize that one, Bitcoin works. So 2 years from now, it'll be 3 years in El Salvador. You're going to see lots more adoption over the next 2 years because
Sure.
there's very little downside for small areas and small jurisdictions to adopt it. It's sort of only a positive for them.
Mhm.
And there's a lot they can benefit from it. But that we have the halving, which I think is going to be right around March, April 2024. We
Yep.
don't know exactly. But around that time. So what are we? We're about a year and a half away. Is that right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And at that halving, Bitcoin stock to flow ratio doubles, and it has at that point double the stock to flow ratio of gold.
Yeah.
And I don't know where other countries are going to be coming along with the CBDCs. And I'd like to make a correction for something I said last week. I said CBDC was central bank digital coin. It's central bank digital currency. Regardless, it's just this digital central bank money that they can control, and that money might be a huge benefit for Bitcoin. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. We were talking about earlier that Bitcoin's hard to understand. Okay, and I get it. I mean, I think the more you study it, the more you realize it's even deeper than you thought on a number of levels.
Yeah. Agree.
But here's an easy, quick way that I think regular people could understand Bitcoin. There's money the government can control and stop you from spending. And there's money that the government cannot control and stop you from spending. The money they control, they give you in like Social Security payments or EBT cards or whatever government, UBI, whatever the government wants to hand out. But they can turn this money on and off. And they can restrict what you can buy with it. Maybe you have an EBT card and you want to buy, 80% of your checkout is Oreos. They're just not going to allow it. Who knows? Maybe you can only spend X% at a liquor store. I don't know. X%. I don't know how that system works that much, but
it's censorable.
it's censorable money. And so I could see where 18 months from now, you have this money with that's highest stock to flow, double the stock to flow of gold, which means it's twice as scarce as gold, and they're not making more of it. And in the future, there's even less being made. And that's going to decline by half every 4 years. And so you have this concept where people kind of wake up like, what is Bitcoin? Oh, I've heard about it. It's kind of everywhere. I mean, all the banks are into it. I can get Bitcoin at almost any bank I go to and almost any ATM I go to some degree. And all these different countries accept it. And it's the money that's not censorable. And it kind of goes up in value. Like there is an increase because when you do have that asset that has the highest stock to flow in the world, it comes with a certain something, meaning it comes with certain types of value because of its scarcity.
Yeah, so I cut out there for a minute. I don't know what happened. My network crashed for a second, but so I didn't hear the last few seconds we were saying, but
it's just that
I'll hear it when I replay it.
You have scarcity. You're going to have increased scarcity that people understand, and money that
it's
can't
going to
be
become
censored.
more scarce.
Right. And I think that people at that point will say, well, I want some of that. And you know what's great about it? I can get it at Schwab. I can get it at Bank of America. If I live in Singapore, I can get it at whatever the Singapore bank's name is. I think didn't PNB in France, they were offering Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So you're going to see globally that you have all the big banks. And this is for the kind of the rich Western countries where they have banks, all the banks will have it. And all the trading platforms will have it. It's going to be pretty ubiquitous. And it doesn't take that long for it to become ubiquitous on all these platforms because we can read the articles now and see they're all planning it. They're all implementing it. So where are we in 18 to 24 months? Well, more.
Right. And not just that, but now you're starting to build on top of that the ability to actually use it to buy things. For, when you look at the growth of the Lightning Network and the capacity that it has to handle transactions, the rate that that's growing is just, pretty astonishing. And as that continues to grow and people accumulate Bitcoin, but now need to spend it, that's going to be the way for them to be able to do that. So it's not just, the base layer of Bitcoin. That is one data point, just like the price is one data point. But the Lightning Network is another really important aspect of it. And as we see that growing at the same rate, even if it's going to level off eventually, but right now the growth rates in Lightning are just off the charts.
Yeah. And that's something else I'd like to talk about in a future episode is the effect that El Salvador has had on the Lightning Network.
Yeah, I think there's a real impact there.
All right, Matt, anything else?
I think that's it for me.
Great. Can you tell people where they can find us, please?
Absolutely. You can find us on the internet at btcbutlers.com. You can email us info@btcbutlers.com. Our Twitter is @btcbutlers and our DMs are open. If you enjoyed this, like Michael said at the beginning, please subscribe, like, download, tell your friends. If you have comments or questions about any topics or articles that we discuss, feel free to drop them in the comments or to reach out to us. And then on top of that, Bitcoin Butlers is ready and waiting to help you implement best practices as a Bitcoin owner, whether that's buying your Bitcoin, storing your Bitcoin, setting up an inheritance plan for your Bitcoin, owning it through a retirement account. All of these things we are able to help you with, and we would love to hear from you if those are things that you're interested in pursuing. And we will see you next time.
Thank you, Matt.
Have a good one. Bye.